It is the spring of 1991, and a Czech airman at American Airlines is sitting in the right seat of an MD-80 simulator, watching a brand new captain try, deliberately, to make the aircraft stop flying. He pulls the nose up, he pulls it further. The stick shaker rattles, the warning horn sounds, and the aircraft simply refuses to cooperate. The nose drops on its own. The wing keeps producing lift. Nothing breaks loose, nothing departs controlled flight, and the new captain, who has spent the last 10 minutes bracing for a violent wing drop, looks over and asks the same question pilots had been asking for a decade. Is that it? That moment, more than almost any other, explains why so many pilots who flew the MD-80 talk about it the way they do. Not because it was fast or modern or particularly forgiving in every respect, but because in the one area where so many other aircraft of its generation could turn deadly in an instant, the MD-80 was almost stubbornly well-behaved. To understand why, you have to go back to where the whole airframe came from, and to a design philosophy that, by the late 1970s, was already considered old-fashioned. The MD-80 was a direct descendant of the DC-9, an aircraft Douglas had launched in April of 1963 around a specific set of priorities. Rear-mounted engines, a T-tail, and a wing designed first and foremost for predictable low-speed handling on short runways. The DC-9 was built for airlines running quick turnarounds between secondary cities, often from runways that left little margin for error. An aircraft that behaved unpredictably near the stall was not just inconvenient, it was a liability that could end programs and end lives. So Douglas engineers built the wing accordingly, and when the MD-80 came along as a stretched, re-engined evolution of the DC-950, that wing philosophy did not get thrown out. It got refined, and it got tested, again and again, against exactly the failure mode that worried everyone most. The MD-80's wing was 28% larger than the DC-950's, with new sections added at both the root and the tip, and the fuselage stretched by 14 feet. On paper, that sounds like a simple scaling exercise, taking something that worked and making it bigger. In practice, the aerodynamic design of that wing, and particularly its leading edge and its twist, was where the aircraft's stall behavior was decided, long before a single test pilot ever pulled the controls back in anger during certification flying. The wing used a combination of leading-edge slats on the outer sections and a clean, carefully shaped inner wing that controlled how airflow separated as the aircraft slowed down. The goal was for the wing to stall from the root outward, and gradually, rather than all at once across the span. Why does that matter so much? Because the way a wing stalls determines what the aircraft does next, and in the history of aviation, that single detail has been the difference between a routine recovery and a fatal accident. If the outer wing, where the ailerons live, stalls first or stalls suddenly, the result is often a wing drop. One wing keeps flying while the other stops producing lift, and the aircraft rolls hard, sometimes violently, in the direction of the stalled wing. At low altitude, there may not be enough room to recover before the aircraft strikes the ground. That kind of departure from controlled flight has been the start of more than one accident report from that era of aviation. But if the inboard wing stalls first, and does so progressively, the ailerons keep working even as the aircraft is clearly telling the pilot it's running out of energy. The roll control stays there, the aircraft gives you somewhere to go, and time to go there. That progressive stall behavior on the MD-80 was not an accident, and it was not free. It was the product of careful, deliberate attention to the wing's twist, known in aerodynamics as washout, where the wingtip is set at a slightly lower angle of attack than the wing root. As the aircraft slows and the angle of attack increases overall, the root reaches its critical angle first. The root stalls, the tip keeps flying, and the ailerons keep responding to the pilot's hand. Pilots who experienced this in the simulator, and occasionally in real conditions during wind shear encounters or low-speed approaches, described the same thing again and again, almost word for word, decades apart and on different continents. The aircraft shook, it buffeted, it got loud and uncomfortable, and the stick shaker activated well before anything dangerous happened. But it did not snap, It did not depart. It just kept flying, tired and complaining loudly about it, until the pilot did something to fix the situation. This is where the MD-80's other defining characteristic comes in, because a forgiving wing only matters if the pilot can actually feel what that wing is doing underneath them. And the MD-80, unlike the fly-by-wire aircraft that would follow it just a few years later, gave the pilot a completely unfiltered connection to the airframe. There were no computers interpreting control inputs, no envelope protection deciding how far the pilot was allowed to go, no software quietly limiting angle of attack, regardless of what the pilot commanded with the control column. The control surfaces were connected to the cockpit controls through conventional cables and hydraulic boost, and what the pilot felt in the controls was, to a meaningful degree, exactly what the aircraft was doing at that moment. As the MD-80 approached a stall, the controls did not go light and dead the way some aircraft do as airflow degrades. They got heavier, and they got buzzy. The buffet running through the airframe transmitted directly into the control column, into the pilot's hands and forearms. Pilots could feel the aircraft working harder before any warning system told them about it in words or tones. The stick shaker, when it activated, was almost a confirmation of something the pilot's hands had already sensed seconds earlier. That tactile feedback loop, wing to controls to pilot, was constant and direct, and it meant that an experienced MD-80 pilot developed an almost physical sense for how close the aircraft was to its limits, long before the numbers on the airspeed indicator told the same story in digits. Compare that to what came next in the industry. The next generation of airliners, built around fly-by-wire systems and digital flight control computers, took a fundamentally different approach to the exact same problem. Instead of designing a wing that behaved gently near the stall and trusting the pilot to feel it coming, these aircraft used computers to simply prevent the pilot from getting anywhere near that edge in the first place. Envelope protection systems would override control inputs, limit angle of attack automatically, and in some configurations make it functionally impossible for the pilot to stall the aircraft at all, regardless of how hard they pulled on the controls. It was, by almost every safety metric the industry tracks, an enormous step forward. Stall-related accidents, which had been a persistent and recurring cause of fatal crashes for decades, dropped sharply across commercial aviation as these systems became standard equipment on new designs. But something else changed too, and it's the part of the story that explains the pilots in that opening scene, and the pilots who, decades later, stood on the tarmac at Dallas-Fort Worth watching the last MD-80 push back for its final flight. On the newer aircraft, the relationship between the pilot and the edge of the flight envelope became indirect. The computer sat between the two. Pilots were trained to trust the protections, and largely, they could and should. But that meant the visceral, physical sense of an aircraft approaching its limits, the buffet, the heaviness in the controls, the feeling of a wing working hard to keep producing lift against the odds, became something many newer pilots simply never experienced firsthand anymore. The aircraft would tell you, through a screen and a chime, well before you could ever feel it yourself. The MD-80 never made that trade, and in a sense, it never had the option to. It didn't need to, because the airframe itself had been built, from the wing root outward, to make the trade unnecessary. The wing's progressive stall characteristics meant the aircraft rarely needed saving from itself. The direct control feel meant the pilot usually knew what was happening before any system had to intervene on their behalf. And the result was an aircraft that, in the one-flight regime where so many other designs of its era had developed reputations for biting hard and without warning, had instead earned a reputation for being almost gentle. Not docile in the sense of being dull or unresponsive, the MD-80 was famously sensitive in pitch, especially on approach, and demanded real, sustained attention during landing. But sensitive and dangerous are not the same thing, and the MD-80 managed to be the former without being the latter, at least near the stall, where it mattered most. There's a reason this distinction mattered so much to the pilots who flew it for decades, sometimes their entire careers. Flying an aircraft that talks to you, that gives you warning through your hands and through your seat, before it gives you warning through a horn or a synthetic voice, builds a different kind of relationship than flying an aircraft that handles those warnings quietly, on your behalf, somewhere in its software. It builds trust, but a specific kind of trust, the trust that comes from understanding a machine rather than simply operating it. Pilots who came up flying the MD-80 often describe a sense of knowing the aircraft the way you might know an old car you've driven for years, where you can tell something's wrong by the way it sounds or feels, long before any warning light comes on the dashboard. When American Airlines retired its fleet on the 4th of September, 2019, that relationship is what came up again and again in the interviews, in the social media posts, in the quiet conversations between crews in the days leading up to those final flights. Pilots talked about the aircraft's honesty. They talked about the buffet on approach, the way it told you exactly where you stood with no ambiguity and no computer smoothing the edges off the experience. Several described feeling, for the first time in years, like they were actually flying the airplane, rather than supervising a system that was flying it for them. None of this means the MD-80 was a perfect aircraft, or that its approach to stall protection was somehow superior in absolute terms to what came after it. The newer systems have unquestionably saved lives in situations where even the most experienced pilot, working from feel alone, under pressure, at night, in bad weather, might not have reacted in time. Automation closed real gaps, gaps that had cost real lives in the decades before. But the MD-80 represents something that, by the time it retired, had largely disappeared from commercial aviation. An aircraft whose safety in one of the most critical flight regimes came not from a system watching over the pilot from above, but from a wing and a control system designed, decades earlier, to be honest with the person sitting behind the controls. That's the part the numbers and the specifications can't fully capture. The MD-80 wasn't hard to stall because a computer wouldn't let it happen. It was hard to stall because Douglas engineers working in the 1970s on a careful evolution of an even older design built a wing that simply didn't want to stop flying and then connected that wing directly, mechanically, honestly, to the hands of the person in the cockpit. For pilots who spent their careers in that cockpit, that connection, more than the speed, the range, or even the noise, was what they meant when they said the aircraft had a personality. It told you the truth, and more importantly, it let you feel it. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep aviation stories, and drop your thoughts in the comments.